Kamla, and everyone. It's great to be here. Really excited to share the stage with these guys. On this panel, you've got over 70 years of combined expertise of really high-level accomplishments across not just the Caribbean, but with global impact as well. So, I think we've all met Anil, and to help us get through these quickly, I'm going to just give a brief one here. Obviously, he's been doing this for a long time with EY. He's really focused on transformation, AI strategy, and cyber resilience, while allowing and supporting innovation within responsible risk management frameworks so that we can have sustainable growth. I think that's really a key theme here today. Mikey, similarly, Thackoor, led projects and operations across the region, and has also authored a book that I think we should all check out, Begin at the End, one of the 7 habits of highly successful people, to reframe project management and leadership through a Caribbean lens. So he really blends that technical expertise with the ethical governance and the human side of this. And many of you have seen Mikey before, and many of you have also seen and heard Edward before, because he's done amazing things in Barbados and really across the Caribbean Commonwealth. So really deep expertise on cybersecurity here. Really can't get more critical of infrastructure than identity. And leading that through a really responsible, audited, certified framework. So really excited to hear what all you guys have to say. And I know everyone's prepared a brief intro, so I'm actually going to go in reverse order here. We'll go through Edward, Mikey, and then Anil. If you guys want to each give your opening, presentation, and then we'll open up the panel.
Sure. Good morning. Good morning. Welcome everybody. I'll just go first then. Is that okay?
Sure, we can let Mikey go first. Yeah.
Okay. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome.
Mikey, go ahead.
I'm going to go straight into it because the window is short and the stakes are real. The arc I'm taking you guys on today goes from power shapes sovereignty. Sovereignty determines dependency. Dependency creates risk. Risk demands agency. Agency requires action. Action confirms responsibility. By the end of these 10 minutes, I want to be clear on one thing. If we don't govern the systems we adopt, those systems will quietly begin to govern us, right? So let's just get into it. AI and geopolitics. Who governs the algorithms? AI has swiftly emerged as the new infrastructure power of the world, warranting our attention away from the beautiful sand, seas, and cool breeze of the Caribbean. When algorithms begin deciding who gets hired, who gets the car loan, who projects get funded, we're not dealing with code, we're dealing with sovereignty, and that hits home. In construction, when governance fails, things don't metaphorically collapse, they literally fall. Just as concrete without reinforcing cracks under pressure, power without governance will crack under stress. Now imagine that failure scaled to the level of nations in our archipelago. So back to the question, who governs algorithm? It's not abstract, it's existential. AI now is that scaffolding for modern power. If left ungoverned, it will shape us more than we shape it, with consequences we must avoid. Simple as that. Sovereignty and geopolitics of code. I'm going to go down the weeds a bit here from my understanding, from my lens, looking at being a senior construction manager. AI governance has become a new diplomacy. The EU governs through rights and restraint. The US governs through markets and innovation. China governs through alignment and control. These are not just regulatory bodies, they're exported worldviews. And in the Caribbean where I live, we currently import these systems and inherently the values embedded in them, whether we like it or not. AI is being used in project management, risk scoring, procurement, labor productivity assessments. But the data behind these tools is not Caribbean driven. It's a different ethics, different conditions, different live realities. We may not code the global, we may not be able to outcode the global giants, but we can outconscious them. If we don't define our own digital destiny, someone else will, and they're not designed for us, that's for sure. I think, I said it before in different forums, The establishment of a Caribbean AI Charter is not just a flag, but a crucial framework for our sovereignty. And CARICOM, please take note. Without it, we risk embedding foreign bias into our national decision systems, replacing old dependencies with digital ones, adopting governance in form, not in function, and mistaking access for agency. Understand, isolation is not independence. Adoption is not ownership. Now, the AI power structure and the Caribbean vulnerability, as I see it here, right? There's 7 companies I can count on my hand that really drive this AI structure. Microsoft, Google, Amazon, Meta, Apple, NVIDIA, and Tesla. They control the chips, the cloud, the models, and the data distribution. It's staggering to understand that they have spent or are spending close to $330 billion per year to secure global dominance. That's more than the entire GDP of the Caribbean region. Let's think in for a second, the amount of money being spent. That is just not innovation. That is a centralization of power. And guess what? It's a closed loop. If you look at it, Microsoft funds OpenAI. OpenAI spends it back in Microsoft Azure for computing power. Microsoft then buys chips from NVIDIA. NVIDIA reinvests in OpenAI. Money circulates, power concentrates. So if we do not produce the data, standards, or compute, we're not participants in AI. We are dependent on it. And dependency is not progress. Dependence is vulnerability wearing modern clothes. In construction, we import, IBC codes, ACI codes, ASCM standards, but we adapt them for hurricane loads, salt exposure, labor conditions, and animal logistics. We never take external standards as raw, in my field at least, because they will fail here. AI is no different. If data doesn't know us, then how can the algorithm represent us? If it can represent us, it will rule us instead. So sovereignty now rests on, I believe, regionally governed data agreements, Caribbean AI standards, shared regulatory bodies, capacity building, not outsourcing. So our problem is not intelligence or talent. Our problem is coordination, and coordination is governance. Security, surveillance, and ethics. AI can keep us safe until it starts keeping score. In the small islands, the temptation to use imported surveillance tools is real. It's for security, they say. But without strong governance, safety mutates into surveillance and oversight turns into overreach. AI that watches us must also answer, and governance must define what AI can do and cannot do, but also what it must never do. In my field, I tell my guys all the time, technology without ethics is a roof with no nails or fasteners. It looks nice until the first strong wind comes by and it's all gone. Ethics is the rebar of governance, invisible but essential. Without it, the whole structure fails under pressure. Governance isn't red tape, it's reinforcement. We must appreciate that. Now, the human side of stuff. We often talk about AI risk as if it's technical. System errors, bias, automation glitches, the works. But some of the most dangerous failures aren't mechanical, they're psychological. Trust me, I've been through a few of them already. Take, for instance, pretexting, a modern form of social engineering. Attackers don't hack systems, they hack people. They use open source intelligence, impersonate authority, and exploit trust. In 2024, a Verizon data breach report found that nearly 1 in 4 financially motivated cyber attacks now come from pretexting. Not malware, brute force, but manipulated judgment. And here's the link. AI will do the same thing at scale. It will manipulate attention, behavior, and belief faster than any human scanner ever could. If the governance doesn't evolve to defend both digital and human parameters, we'll keep patching systems while people remain the biggest open door we have. The first breach is silence. The second is the hack. That is, proven. Okay. Now, governance in construction. I can only speak from my side of the pond, which is construction. This is the lens I'm coming from. Flawed as it may be. Let me bring this home to a bit. In my book, and I'll plug it shamelessly, begin at the end, I describe governance as the central nervous system of any project. The structure is the backbone, the committee is the process, the controls. People are the nerves, carrying accountability ethical signals throughout the organization. Information is the bloodstream, flowing constantly through dashboards, reports, and decisions. When these three connect, the project moves with coordination and clarity. When one fails, the system trembles. We feel it. Now replace project with AI ecosystem. The same logic applies. The same logic applies. Caribbean agency, from rule taker to rule maker. Now I'm not naive. We in the Caribbean islands, we can't outspend the tech giants. However, we can't outthink them. We have mastered our resilience in the physical world. Now we must remaster and master the digital one. AI for us must be trained on us, our data, our dialect, our social rhythms. Otherwise, we'll keep paying for systems that misunderstand us and misjudge us. We just don't need adaptation or adoption. We need authorship. We need to write our own destiny. You know, I'm happy and I'm all for the CTU's AI task force, you know, which is already moving in that direction. But it needs help. It needs synchronization. It needs one voice, one standard, one conscience. They can't do it by themselves. You know, our governance must be Caribbean by design, light on bureaucracy, heavy on accountability, because we, small economies, can't afford to make big mistakes. So we can't outcode them, but we can outconscious them, I believe, 100%. You know, corporate accountability. Every algorithm is a policy. You know, every algorithm a company releases is a policy in disguise. It governs behavior, access, opportunity, quietly, invisibly, and continuously. That means boards, executives must add algorithmic accountability to their governance charters. They must. They must ask, what values is algorithm optimizing for? Efficiency, profit, or fairness? Who signs off when it fails? Who's responsible when the buyer scales faster than the business? AI, whatever form it takes, will expose governance gaps faster than any audit ever can. And transparency isn't open code, it's open consequence. Accountability is the real algorithm of trust, I believe. Now, algorithms in construction. Why should it matter to me in my world and people who live in my world? You know, as a construction professional, who cares who writes algorithm? Because those systems, and you should care, they already shape how we plan, price, and perform in construction. Tender evaluations, procurement scoring, even risk registers, all increasingly guided by AI models in the pursuit of service and efficiency, because we want to move faster. You think you're competing on merit and price? No, you're competing on an algorithm where someone else decides your value as a contract in the Caribbean. If that algorithm was trained on foreign data, different cost structures, different metrics, different safety norms, different contract types, then you're being judged by someone else's context. If the algorithm is the referee and you don't know who wrote the rules, you are not playing the game. You are the game. When AI asks you to draft, when you ask AI to draft your risk register, it prioritizes global trends, not local realities. It underweighs island logistics, labor volatility, and hurricane disruption. When you ask it to draft a contract letter, it adopts a tone by Western legal structures. You know, adversarial at best at sometimes, not relationship driven. That's who we are in the Caribbean, where we are people bounded by that, you know? When you outsource your words, I tell my team all the time, you outsource your intent. So yes, these algorithms matter in my world. They influence tone, perception, compliance, and ultimately outcomes. If we don't govern the tools, they'll quietly govern us. And here's something deep, right? The next colonialism wouldn't come with ships, it'll come with software. That's why AI governance isn't an IT issue, it's a leadership issue, I believe. It's about ensuring the systems we depend on reflect our ethics, our voice, and our vision. Now, it's not all doom and gloom, of course. Moving the needle. How do we fix this? I believe. How do we move from being governed by algorithms to governing through them, to using this tool? You know, first we say, you know, build context-aware governance frameworks. We need systems that reflect our economies, vulnerabilities, and our ethics, not imported templates. We need to create a regional AI governance council. You know, CARICOM, CTU, academia, whatever. One table, one standard, one voice. Secure data sovereignty. If we don't own our data, we don't own our destiny. Train leaders in algorithmic literacy. You don't have to be a code writer, but you must understand what's being automated in your name. Foster a culture of ethical curiosity. Reward those who question and protect those who challenge. AI isn't the enemy. Indifference is. Silence is compliance, and in the Caribbean, we can't afford to be silent. AI, like I told you before, will expose gaps faster than we can close them. The responsibility to rule ourselves, don't take it lightly. AI can enhance governance, but it will never replace judgment in any field, especially in mines. Until our ethics evolve as fast as our algorithms, the real risk isn't that machines will rule us, it's that we will quietly surrender our responsibility to govern ourselves. Governance isn't bureaucracy, it's the backbone, it's the courage to decide, discipline to follow through, and humility to adapt. In construction, I remind my team, gravity is undefeated. Ignore it, collapse inevitable. Respect it, and you build something that lasts. Governance, gravity, invisible, constant, and merciless when ignored. It's time we build that in the Caribbean. Thanks very much. Appreciate it.
Wow. Mikey, thank you. That was moving.
From here.
That's a hard
From
one to
here.
follow. Yeah. Thank you for that.
Appreciate it, man.
Edward, do you think you can follow up with that and then we'll wrap up with Anil?
Yes. Good morning, everyone. What Mikey said is very, very interesting, and I don't think I could walk his shoes here. But let me get started. And it is the truth, because you bring real reality to a situation that is very grave, but still kept in a very, very small corner. So I just want to thank CCGI very much for allowing me to be on this panel to share my thought leadership and actionable functions and activities that the region can undertake to achieve a sustained program and initiative, safeguarding the sovereignty that you hear Mikey would have talked about, and enhancing the region's digital economies. So digital transformation, whether in its current form or another, will continue to change our lives, possibly into the next century, whether we are aware of it or not. Digital transformation toolkits, AI embodied to achieve purpose, development, and evolution, highlights the dominance of AI and continue to do so throughout human evolution. Currently, the development of AI, or artificial intelligence, is progressing rapidly, especially among leading economic countries such as the United States, China, the UK, India, and the UAE. Analysts believe that within this war-centric light atmosphere, AI could advance significantly, potentially reaching a stage known as artificial general intelligence by 2030 and beyond. To further enhance this realization, global AI foreign direct investment, as you would hear, kind of like what Mikey would have alluded to, is expected to reach 22% in 2025 and exceed $1.2 trillion by 2029. That is unprecedented and can raise many concerns, especially where AI trustworthiness is still plaguing humanity. For businesses that provide products and services, including governments, AI can be an emerging risk that is not yet well understood. The OECD value-based principles for trustworthy AI highlights the need for AI in its development, deployment, and utilization to be inclusive in its growth, or inclusive growth, sustainability, development, and well-being, awareness around human rights and democratic values, including fairness and privacy, transparency and explainability, robustness, security and safety, and accountability. Some of these things that you would hear Mikey mention. Understand these principal values, we are still not yet there, where these vital characteristics can be monitored, gauged, and reported on AI trustworthiness. In my articles, which I would have published in PCB and other places, I looked at emerging risks, AI, the intersection of AI and cybersecurity, governance, and risk management in the age of intelligent systems. And finally, from the risk to resilience building and securing digital economies, I highlighted the importance of understanding the risks surrounding AI and implementing AI risk management strategies through an AI management system program framework based on the ISO standard 42001 to reduce not only liabilities to the company, to the boards, etc., but to also safeguard our sovereignty. As Mikey would alluded, many of these systems are not trained by our data. We do not make these systems. We are, in essence, users. We are commodity users of these systems. So therefore, understanding these risks, especially as a region that is developing with many, many constraints, our focus has to be on national sovereignty and global governance of such systems, the security, surveillance, and the ethics around the use of AI. Caribbean agencies in the AI landscape, when we look at the development of AI governance frameworks and et cetera, corporate and government accountability and liabilities. On that note, in concluding my opening statement, I hope to further this discussion with other esteemed panelists on this crucial topic regarding our national security and sustainable human and economic development. And I'm leaving some time that where Liz can actually ask some questions that I think is very pertinent as we go forward. So thank you.
Thank you, Edward. Really looking forward to having your perspective on all the standards and how we make sure we apply those fairly and consistently to respect everybody and everybody's sovereignty. I'm hearing a theme here. So Anil, I'm excited to hear what you've got to say. Welcome.
Thank you, and thank you to the Caribbean Governance Institute. I think a lot of the pivotal areas were touched on by Mikey and Edward. So I'll try to be pretty concise here. Let me unpack the term algorithm, because that was used as a thematic statement. I think when we look at algorithm, an AI algorithm, we need to put it in context. AI on the whole, when you look at an AI ecosystem, those things are built with data. It's built with the algorithm. And then coming out of that, you can have the model, right? And the model, as we know it, might be a ChatGPT, the ones we interact with on our day-to-day basis, Claude, etc. The data itself, think about it as the ingredients to feed the algorithm. Think about the algorithm as those rules, instructions that will be given to operate on the data, to learn patterns, right? And make decisions, even autonomously, make predictions. And the model will be the finished dish, right? When everything's packed together. So it's important to understand that, because there's a certain amount of autonomous behavior that comes out of a model when we talk about an AI ecosystem. And an important fact, and this is my first point, it's not neutral. And it's never neutral. And the AI models that we tend to deal with, they don't have a sense of neutrality about them. So much so that the Caribbean has found it prudent to look towards maybe the Latin American region to say maybe we need something special for our area. There's a concept called LATAM GPT, which is a special model that's being built to deal with Caribbean context, Caribbean governments, for instance. And it's supposed to be more reflective of our region. An algorithm and a model generates, or it has a natural bias in it, right? It demonstrates priorities, sometimes ideologies. So it actually makes judgment. That's the difference between a reasoning engine like AI and a recall engine like Google. And that's important to note. So the first point is there's a certain level of inherent bias in these AI algorithms. And what that says is that there's a responsibility that should go along with it. And I use the word should very, piercingly there. The next point I'd like to drive is that AI is very topical, and we use it loosely and use it wrongly as well. But generally, we see a growth in three things in particular. We see technology. There's been a vast revolution in technology, even in our region here, unsurpassed. In addition to that, there's a lot of business adoption of technology and AI. So these two are moving not exactly in parallel, but they are moving at scale. Moving at scale too is also governance, but at a different scale and a different speed. What does that do? it widens a gap between technology adoption, AI adoption, and governance is moving. It's on the uplift or upswing, but certainly not where it needs to be. And as AI grows and technology adoption grows, governance continue to grow. But that gap, you can see it in a year, 2, 3 years, you project it. You're going to see gaps widening. And that's the absolute truth. Okay? It's far outpacing regulations, for instance. Right? We know when we conducted a survey just recently, there were about maybe 90 to 95% of organizations, and these are both private and public sector businesses that are investing in AI, right? Regulation is considered to be in the infancy stage. Good. But what's happening is that companies themselves understand that they should and more than likely are adopting, but they also need to have that oversight and control mechanism built in. And that's where a concern is actually rising. Why is it now a geopolitical issue? And who governs AI really? And it is said that who governs AI actually governs the future. We speak, and one of our previous speakers, he mentioned, I think it's AGI, Artificial General Intelligence. And we're actually getting into that phase now, right? We are actually in the phase of narrow intel, which is getting AI to do very specific tasks. Drive cars, perform some level of automation for tasks that are very repeatable, and do very specific jobs. We can get it to do a lot more, and it's almost there. AI in itself and its self-tuning and self-learning capabilities is actually shocking developers, right? Guys like Hinton and so on, they don't know, they can't define what it looks like. And that's important to note as well. So who governs the algorithm can help to dictate a lot of what it might look like and to prevent what it shouldn't look like as we move forward. And that's important because there should be fairness, accuracy, and all of the wonderful things that go along with it, safety. Now, those are not topmost in most organizations' minds. That doesn't bring AI discussion to the table, the governance. Unfortunately, it comes up as a sideline conversation, and that's the absolute truth. But it is a core enabler. It's a core enabler for business, and it's also a core enabler for state. We noticed that it has gone way beyond what our expectation is for it, and also into areas and domains that were really not foreseen before. We understand the business impact and the business use of it to some extent, but the future is undefined. It influences defense, national security, all aspects of trade, and even social values. We don't know what AI does to our data and our data sets and what we feed to those social media algorithms. We don't know, but it has been very good at what it's doing. If you look at what's fed to you from an advertisement perspective, many times it's spot on or very close to being there. And that's very important to note. Good. What does that mean? How do all of these things come together? Well, there are some risks that are inherent inside there, and we spoke about it, some of them, right? If we take surveillance, for instance, it's being used in a very big way in some jurisdictions, facial recognition. And there's an invasion of privacy that can occur, and it can creep. Good. That's important to note. How do you control that? Some states are more conservative than others. How do you do that at a state level, at a federal level? There's Gen AI, which exists. We use it. You can have misinformation and deep fakes and all of these, these terminologies we hear. They themselves come with a certain degree of risk. Good. They impact security, cyber security. We look at autonomous systems. I use systems rather than things like self-driving vehicles. It's a lot wider than it is. Physical AI is actually a big thing now. Humanoids will very soon become very affordable to the average business and soon enough to the average household. that changes the way you live, the way you interact. And there's an absolute truth there. I think the big barrier to AI adoption today is cost. And when that goes down, and it does, as we saw with the whole computer revolution, cost went down. Every household today owns a computer device, a cell phone at minimum. That's a computing device. So the second point there is these things come with risks, and we don't know where it's going. How do you regulate against something that's undefined? So you're going to find some regulatory principles, but you don't know all the things that it should apply to. And that's my second point, and I'll move to the last one. So I heard one of our speakers mention about, I believe, the standard for AI, ISO standard 42001. That exists. It's a standard. It's a base standard, and you can get certified against it. One might want to ask, how do you certify against something that's not clearly defined at this stage? So it might be putting the cart before the horse. When we look across the globe, we see some regulations that have really evolved, or they have landed on the table. The EU AI Act being one of those first. And the European Union has been very adamant about putting regulations out first. We go back to GDPR in 2016, got enforced in 2018. Very important to note, if I look at the EU AI Act and I put them on the table side by side with the GDPR, there are lots of similarities. Very important to note. And it's going to apply to all European countries. Does it impact us? It absolutely does. Just like privacy and the GDPR, if we do business in Europe, we can be penalized for breaking the legislation there because of the fact that we are targeting the European citizens. And that's how the law is constructed and crafted. It's important to note. We look at the US, there's no single federal regulation around AI. Some states are actually a little further along. You look at Colorado, which people would generally not think of. It is actually put an AI Act in place. New York is looking at certain regulations around bias, AI bias in hiring. So the states are taking the onus upon themselves. Why is all that happening? Well, we could speculate, right? Who owns the algorithm dominates. That's important to know and understand. Canada has recently put an act in place. It's called the IDA. Not sure if it's for the enforcers yet. We look at Great Britain and China itself. China has issued some guidelines and regulations around it. Problem is, if AI impacts us across the globe, country to country, and we have those international type interactions, how can we regulate domestically and expect it to be in sync? And that's a challenge by itself. Good. So we look at the governance model, which drive the regulations, or vice versa. From an approach standpoint, you're going to see some of them, like the EU itself, being more risk-based, and it's rights-based, human rights. Good. The US might be about innovation first. That's their approach. And China might be more about, state control and security first. So the focus and the drive might be different, and that drives how the regulation is crafted. And of course, that influences governance. So again, very difficult to regulate on something that's undefined, and having regulations at a domestic level or at a country level can prove to be beneficial, but leave gaps when you look at a global ecosystem. Okay, there are some fundamental components within AI that the regulations tend to pay attention to. It's accountability, bias and fairness, explainability, security, reliability. And these things, if anybody's familiar with the GDPR, that's the privacy regulation in Europe, you would recognize there are lots of similarities. I think both were crafted on the same types of principles and same foundation. Very important to note. All right. And I think there are some penalties that are already imposed on companies. There's a company called Clearview. I believe they were fined over 30 million euros. I think their breach might have been, or their non-compliance might have been around data privacy and not specific to AI. It is an AI-based company, but it's important to note that the legislation that they may have also breached, or more primarily breached, would have been the GDPR privacy regulation. All right. So just some key points, just the takeaways here. Algorithms carry their own biases. We're attempting actually to regulate something that's really not clearly defined as yet. And also, finally, that AI is moving at a pace that's unsurpassed. I think everybody would have heard about the number or the adoption when ChatGPT first came on. Incredible, right? And that imbalance is becoming a real geopolitical fault line issue. Thank you.
Wow. Yeah, Anil, thank you for that. That was I really appreciate the deep dive and the kind of just I guess zooming out and looking at what the world is doing about this, and trying to kind of orient our place in it. So I've heard a few common themes here, and it's great to hear everybody is really thinking about sovereignty and digital sovereignty, and how do you actually stay in control of this stuff. And I guess there are a few questions that come to mind. First off, when you're working with organizations, what's the most common mistake that you see that you kind of shake your head at, and what's kind of the easiest thing to avoid that you see out there already?
I would say, Luis, I think I have some internet issues here on my side, but one of the greatest travesty, and Anil had mentioned, and I think Mikey too, is data governance. In cybersecurity, and even in data protection and data privacy operations, to remain in compliance, data governance is still a very key area that many companies are still lagging behind. So when it comes to AI now, or any digital transformation tool, the use of data is extremely critical. So if there is a lack of maturity when it comes to data governance, you're going to find that they're creeping in now to AI, how you train it. Is it going to form any form of bias? Is it going to have underhanding, especially when it comes to the, Anil to mention the algorithm itself? How is that algorithm changing in particular environment? So our two, from my perspective, our two key areas is one, data governance, and that AI impact on the organization, even on the customers themselves or the clients, etc. So not having that great level of understanding, it really blows my mind away of how businesses are visualizing how AI can be changing the environment. The inability, as I mentioned earlier, the inability to monitor, engage, and report how AI is functioning is still at a loss. I mean, take Mikey, for instance. You're building a building, architects are using AI within the operation. Who's to say bits and pieces that you're changing the formula that little bit? In other words, at those stretch points, you might cut something back by 1 millimeter. How does that affect the load bearing and so forth? So what I'm saying, I'm an adversary because it doesn't control my algorithm. I'm not able to monitor and have reports on it. How am I know that my environment is changing, my sovereignty is changing? We have an issue with crime within the region. How is that being contributed by targeted type of media to our young people? I think we call it Gen Z. So the travesty here is lack of data governance that is still plaguing organization, and the awareness that AI impact awareness or risk around AI within the operation itself is just used almost blatantly and then discover issues afterwards. So it's not responsibly deployed within the organization.
Yeah. Well, I know a lot of folks that I've spoken to, employees are just using ChatGPT kind of ad hoc, right? There's not a lot of restrictions on it. And even at some of the big consulting firms, they're kind of boxed in. They not to pick on anyone here, but just other folks I know, that, you know, even within some of the big consulting firms where they have a tool set that they're given, folks will email themselves stuff and, you know, use ChatGPT or whatever on the side. So, I mean, how do you really control that? Because at the end of the day, that's a human problem. Like, how do you actually wall that off?
Awareness is key. In any technological deployment, and now we live in that digital transformation age, you have to have awareness. And this is something that I would have discussed last week during a global business week conference that we had here in Barbados, is where many of the executives believe that awareness might not be so mature as it should be, or it's supposed to be in particular areas. The fact is that AI is used throughout the whole organization. So from top to bottom, you need to have that level of awareness, not only in its operations, but how AI will enable and can be a negative part for the organization, how to use the tools, what to expect from the tools. And I am certain many of us here have used ChatGPT and other solutions. And when we read it, you know what I'm saying, we take it for granted. Somebody say, no, let's go back and check. You know, it does not represent what we were actually originally typing. So therefore, that constantly, we do a lot of cybersecurity awareness training every single day so to minimize risk to our organization. But when it comes to AI, it's just allowed to run loose until something happens, and then you start to have that level of awareness creeping in where you know what, you need to have that awareness program on AI through the organization.
Got it. Anil and Mikey, what are you guys seeing on that front?
So I can tell you, and again, real world, activities here. When we treat AI like an IT tool, it's a rollout, it's a tool upgrade, but really it's not. It's a decision maker they're using and not understanding the mechanics behind it. And for instance, whether you're using Microsoft Project or Oracle P6, right, for scheduling, many times I run across problems where, I get a schedule back and I'll see the line move, critical path is shifted, and I ask the question, why? What happened here? And then they can't answer. They really can answer. What would move that? And so they're just letting the machine decide for them without understanding the biases behind it. And it's because, some little EMA. I'm like, EMA? What are we talking about? This is the Caribbean. So, taking it for granted, So I say, we gotta fix that. You have accountability and transparency. Governance isn't paperwork, it's about ownership. AI doesn't remove bias enough. It industrializes that for sure,
Yeah. It's a quick one, maybe to add there, Lewis, and I think both Mikey and Edward would have driven home those points. Certainly education of the workforce and the people would be necessary. I totally endorse that. If we look at AI as an asset, which it is, we treat assets with a certain amount of caution, responsibility, and accountability. That's very important. It has value. In legislation, when we look at privacy legislation in the Caribbean, the JDPA, for instance, in Europe and in the US, there are things called administrative controls and there are technical controls. Some of the administrative controls may be, as Edward indicated, educating your workforce. Make sure that they go through training, they are equipped. That's giving the man the resilience to be able to do what he has to do and do it well and do it responsibly. But then there are technical controls that a company should enforce. You can't restrict every single thing, right? There'll be no usability, but certainly you can restrict up to a point. So a combination of education and technical controls can narrow that to a point where it's almost palatable for the company. You have less to worry about. So it's very important, and those things have to be driven by policy, right? And the workforce must be aware of what the policy is. They must comply with it. And if they don't, guess what? You come into a workplace, there are responsibilities and accountabilities. And if you can't comply, there must be implications.
Anil, Lewis, I want to add to what Anil is practically saying, because this is very critical component here. Technology, within the last, if we go back 20, 30 years, has been somewhat static. So we didn't expect much. We are now using, based on marketing and quote unquote capabilities, we are using a system that behaves like a human being. And as Mikey have mentioned, once it gets it right a couple of times, our human nature automatically start to trust. We don't check, we don't go far. So if we are operating on our policies, our risk management, even government, I always ask the question, where do I see risk managers in government to help build policies that will create the, start enacting the regulations and laws, or the laws, laws and regulations and etc. So when you come to the company now, we still operating on a very archaic understanding of what technology is, especially when it comes from the boards and so forth. And we are dealing with now technology that is changing so rapidly. I mean, people say computers change. Computers are unintelligent. It just gets faster, you load software, whatever it is. But now you're using something that you're interacting, you're talking to it on days, you're taking outputs and so forth. It is more in line with what we want to talk to. And sometimes we see it as a child, those of us who understand see it as a child learning. There are others that see it as just you and me. So therefore, if our policies are not dynamic as much as possible, regardless if it's within the organization or within the government arena, we're going to find then that a lot of these things are lagging behind to initiate the changes that are definitely required. So that is one of the reasons why I personally have joined Kamala. She might not understand that, but I have literally joined her because it is very important on where I sit right now, is to help persons to understand that digital transformation is not a static environment. It's not a static system. It's not a static terminology. You have to be constantly there. And if you're not, and let's say you're tired, or you may be of the certain biological age or psychological age not to take it on, you don't need to have a team that's willing to be able to understand, support that team and enable it so that you can understand. And this goes the same thing for government. Understand the risk is not only to the business, but within your country, because I would have mentioned sovereignty here and national security. Anil would also mention the same thing. We are using systems that we just don't know how they're changing our environment. We just don't know. So therefore, our risk strategies now need to be more aware of that and start falling to be extremely dynamic. Not every month or maybe every quarter or every year. It has to be proactively there assessing and assessing.
Yeah. And with the widening gap between governance and technology, and it feels like obviously you all touched on, as the mega corporations control the innovation and the models and the offerings more or less, you can never really keep up, right? Because they're always going to change and you're going to have to react. They're not going to really consult government. That's, like you said, the US model of innovation. And I think most of us are, still operating primarily under that kind of, worldview of technology and on those platforms. And, how do you start to bring some of those things regionally and domestically? Do you see, I know in Trinidad, for instance, there's actually a data center that's, government owned and managed through, state-owned enterprise. And across the Caribbean, there are other data centers that are available, but, how much effort are companies or states really doing to, run large language models or do that training for LATAM GPT on hardware and, connections that actually retains all that data and knowledge within the Caribbean? Is that something people are really working on? And how do you see organizations, kind of managing that balance when there is so much at stake?
Anyone go? I could go second.
Yeah, sure, no problem. So I can say that there's a lot of conversation taking place now, Louis. There's hardly a board meeting that would not have AI as a topic of a discussion. That's the absolute truth.
Right.
What is implemented might be a far cry from what's aspired. And that's okay too, right? we do see what we call shadow AI, just like we had shadow IT. So those things are there, they exist in the organization, and man, you have a lot of AI shops within every company. That's the truth. And everybody's an AI expert. I think your question was around, how do we manage how do we put the ring fence and the belts and braces around the AI that we want to implement in our organization? It's not there to be a grave concern at this particular point in time. Like I said, the shadow AI apart, if we look at AI within the organization, we want to automate or use AI to make a process more efficient, where we have our corporate data is being trained on that. Very few good examples would exist at this stage. I can say that there are some initiatives now in train with companies. There are successful implementations. You probably will be able to pick them out, very sporadically across the region. Are the correct belts and braces being put around these initiatives? Not as yet, right? But it's not necessarily isolated as a Caribbean problem. It's still a global problem. I think the discussion needs to take place, and all the different stakeholders and companies need to get together. Those in charge of second line of defense, risk management, need to be there in the frontline operations discussions, right? Mikey, you seem to be in the construction side of things, right? You don't control what goes into the production line. You're liable to get something that's really not sound and solid that you're looking for from an output perspective. How do you do that? You have quality control along the entire process. And how do you get quality control? You bring it what we call the different lines of defense. I'm sure the CCGI would be familiar with that. And if you have those discussions taking place in a real meaningful manner, and you have the stakeholders who are the decision makers with the purses and with the accountabilities, then you're going to find you have a more solid output. So until such time and until such structure and process is put in place, we're going to remain with an output risk.
All right, let me go. I would say this need have driven some of us to look at a formulation of an institute within the region that want to push from the top, I would say from all angles, the need for capacity building. We are waiting, sometimes it seems so, for someone externally to come to us and say, you need to do this. What we are saying is that we ourselves need to do this. If you're a part of a company or a government and you know AI is going to be a risk to your organization, you just don't know, you have to start building the capacity in your organization to train persons. If you have a possible awareness of how algorithms going to work in somebody else's country or environment and so forth, you need to start building that within your environment. If it is, it also means you having a form of public-private, or at least a private academia partnership. The fact is that we have our universities here within the region. How much work is being done for that particular aspect? I would have speak at the Five Island UWI AI conference and also mentioned that is that we have to build capacity to be able to achieve a lot of things that we want to achieve here. And if we don't do that, it means then that we're going to be waiting on someone else. In terms of the necessary infrastructure, until we understand that a capacity is needed, it doesn't make sense sometimes even building a data center or have something that somebody is not going to use. So I think it takes a whole strategic, that public-private academia partnership to come to that level of awareness. And when I say private, it includes Mikey, it includes ourselves, it includes other persons from different industries to highlight many of the needs and start working on some frameworks, not to, I know I might get some lashes for this down the road, but not to say we want to do something and we taking pictures and we having funding and then we don't go anywhere. We need to really start operating at all levels, whether it be at the governance level or at the operational level, to make sure that a lot of these things are actionable and put out there so that we can start developing the region, analyze where you're going to just be building or want to build data centers with no ideology of where it's going to go, We're going to be using a lot of funding money and not achieving. We're going to be using a lot of tools that are not our own, and therefore putting ourselves at risk, regardless of that socially, politically, culturally, etc.
Yeah. Well, Ben, I hear you, and I think you really hit on an important point there, which is, you know, a lot of folks, there is actually capacity. There's an incredible wealth of talent and capacity in the region, but some of the most brilliant people from Trinidad and the Caribbean that I know have gotten frustrated with the status quo and the pace of things and the limitations or the, you know, inaction that they've left. And, you know, that's why we end up seeing the brain drain, and, you know, we lose some of those, you know, the best people aren't actually contributing back to the Caribbean anymore. And so, you know, how do we clear some of those roadblocks and actually empower those people to really apply their best talents and efforts to drive change, instead of being consistently kind of stymied and frustrated by somebody who's maybe not ready for change?
The region has to be socially and culturally be ready. If you look at China, you look at America, right now there's an AI war, AI-centric creation development war, where a country is saying we have to be number one. What is the region saying? So until we get to that point where we see it as our culture and social fabric, where we start looking at a regulatory and legal point of views, where you say, okay, if someone create AI and it affects us, how can we, through the International Court of Law, be able, all these type of things, to be able to transfer, quote unquote, transfer that risk to them and say, you know what, we need to, you know, you need to accept some liabilities. So therefore, until that social and cultural fabric becomes so ingrained in us, we're going to have a drop in capacity due to brain drain. We're going to have a drop in capacity because we're not training persons constantly to be able to respond to these ever-changing environment. And we're not able to have the awareness at whatever level that we need to have, because we are asking our persons to be competitive as much as possible, and you see the time, to be competitive as much as possible. But in the meantime, we are opening ourselves to a grave level of risk that we don't know until something happens, and then we realize, you know what, that becomes our emerging risk, which I'm told by many, sometimes risk managers, they don't believe in it, you know. But there are many times when things are happening, and Mikey could tell you, if you don't know about certain risks in your construction, you're going to pay at the end of the some cycle. And then if it seems that it's something that was done wrong, then 10, 20, 30 years down the road, you're then held liable. And I think that that's something that we in the region not realizing when it comes to compliance, to regulatory things that are slowly growing globally, that we have to be compliant with. So I'm going to leave it there because we are really out of time.
Well, thank you so much. There's, you know, I can feel you're very passionate about this, and that's a key thing to actually drive change, man. So keep it up, you know, and keep pushing. I do want to open up to Q&A from the audience. If anyone has questions, I'm not sure if you want to invite them up on camera or just drop it in the chat.
Oh, either way is fine, Louis. Persons sometimes like to engage directly. So if anyone would like to, you know, please raise your virtual hand. So Louis would be able to nicely and seamlessly invite persons to speak, or you can put your question in the chat and we'd look at it. There was a question earlier, actually, I think from Ulrich Miller.
Yeah.
So Ulrich, if you are able to, if you want to unmute and probably just elaborate on the question a little bit, because I think it really was a important point. I'm not, all right, he is unmuted. Go ahead, Ulrich.
Yes, good morning. I think it's still morning. Good morning, all. And yes, very, very informative conversation. I think that it really is an eye-opener. And my question, the one I think it's being alluded to, is how do we build algorithmic intelligence or understanding from a human perspective? I think if you ask the man in the street what is an algorithm, they generally wouldn't have a clue. I think very few people understand what this thing algorithmic bias, or what an algorithm is all about, and how it's developed, and all of the components that go into it. So from a human perspective, getting people to understand that in the first place and bringing them, I know, yes, the awareness component as well as the education side. But I think there needs to be a conversation that starts to take place around understanding at a deep level what these things really mean, how they came about. You know, looking at it from that point of view, I mean, I've been involved in technology for many years, and you know, the whole concept of if then else do, that kind of thing, you know, was from a programming perspective. But as we move now into this level where it also takes on a learning component to that, so that as you ask that question, what else do you learn from it, and how do you develop that learning and continue it onwards? People are, you know, trying to get our minds around that. As I say, from a human perspective, I think is an issue. So that's the question: how do you really get to that level?
I can attempt, Ulrich, and you seem to work on the green screen, if I can say that, from many years ago. So it's an interesting question. I think if we put it in practical terms, most people don't know how a computer actually works, and what happens when you do keystrokes, what happens at the memory level, what happens at the BIOS level, all of these things. Some people do, and I think the people who need to understand it, there's an education path for them. The ones who need to use it, there's a separate education path, and there can be a little bit of overlap there. So I think we need to understand what we are directing that learning, or to which subgroup we are directing the learning to, right? But if we step away from it now, certain things must be known and understood. And so you move with different types of user groups. The people who need to understand the tech would have a different type of learning. They would guide businesses, governments, etc., as to how to do it and do it responsibly. I think those things need to be driven. The education needs to be there for them, and it also needs to be driven by policy. I will keep on being repetitive and sound like a broken record from a policy perspective. And I mean at a national level, right? At that macro level, and then coming down to private and also other state entities as well. So that's very important. When companies have to comply, there's a push factor, right? You can't get away that easily. But then there's a responsibility within the companies themselves, the entities themselves, to actually apply good governance and governance principles. Learning paths must be carved out. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question directly, Ulrich, but my point is, for the ones who need to be technical, they should be given a path and the material and the avenues to be able to build their knowledge and understanding of how these things work, and be able to advise companies, entities, governments, etc. For John Public, there needs to be public education, awareness. What do you do? What do you put in? Where does it go? Are you putting yourself at risk at a personal level? That's not there. It's not understood. I have never seen a media article in Trinidad dealing with those sorts of issues or questions that could arise.
Yeah, and you know, as Edward alluded, you know, you build trust off of these systems. As soon as they get a couple things right, you start to trust them.
Yeah.
But my next question was that AI is not trained to say I don't know, and therefore it's inclined to make up stuff. And so you led down that pathway. You know, you just take it and you figure whatever it does is gospel, because it got a couple things right. So you start to trust it. And then you find yourself in a position where, you know, trying to go through that verification process creates an issue.
Yeah, very charismatic, right? AI is. It's going to tell you it with conviction. So you walk away feeling, you know, you're comfortable with the response. I have the answer now. I'm empowered. And that's the absolute truth. I think most people are advised and should be advised that, and that's an important point as well. You need to take responsibility for the AI output, not AI. AI is not there to defend itself. In fact, you can question it and it'll go back and correct itself if you tell it to look at a particular data source or an alternative. And that's the truth. So the owner of the AI response is the individual, not the machine.
I will state something a little bit so unorthodox from here. There are certain tools that only certain professionals can use, or sometimes even purchase. AI is one tool that anybody can have, and the ramifications of using it, depending on which field you're in regards to if you're in full automation. We hear it with lawyers, where you have hallucination with cases that doesn't exist. The fact is that, as we all would have mentioned, is that the awareness is so critical, and having persons who use AI to understand that they could be held accountable by unchecked outputs used in decision makings is so critical that if they don't understand that, I think we're gonna miss the buck. And I think everyone is waiting for AI to be 100% correct. We don't know when that's going to happen. And my greatest fear, even if that happens, I'm very aware of the mis and disinformation that is existing out there right now. So while you might do something in your area that might seem right, what about the other suggestions and news? Right now, when I watch news and I see some stuff on YouTube, I don't even know if they're real or not. There are some things that the way how the person moving ahead, I say that doesn't look right. But there's never a statement saying that this is AI generated, this has some AI components, whatever the situation is. And I think that is going to be very critical, especially within our region, from a regulatory point of view, to start insisting any content that is coming within our region is labeled. Our only problem is that when there's going to be infractions, how can we in the International Court of Law? Because it is very the Caribbean, and forgive me, anyone who's here, I'm a citizen of the Caribbean, and I do not feel that we have some form of clout in the international court when something affects us. AI is that very critical piece. It's not a computer, it's not a data scientist, not anything. AI, everything's being digitally transformed and is going to be delivered to us through some form of AI-driven automation. When it goes wrong, what is our repercussions? What is our drive to make sure that whatever is delivered to the region, it is safe? We do it through food, we do it through other products, but when it comes to software in general, I don't think that we have any real regional laws, if you guys are CARICOM or not, to make sure that if some form of risk to your national security, etc., what is the ramifications going to be?
Yeah, no, Edward, I love what you have just shared. And Claire has put a question in the chat that I think really hits the mark. You know, she's asking, when is the right time to regulate or establish governance rules for AI when we are aware of the rapid changes still taking place in its growth? And it's really been the question that I've been mulling all this while as I'm listening to all of our panelists. So, Anil, what would you suggest?
No
Thanks, you know why?
no
Because
problem at all.
it's a governance issue.
Yeah, I think the right time to regulate is yesterday.
Yesterday.
And
Yes.
by that I mean the AI didn't come to the table yesterday or a year from now. It has been there for some time. We don't know where it's going to land, but we know directionally where it's going. Good. It's undefined, right? The spectrum is very wide, but there are some fundamental governing principles that could apply. Fairness, accountability. The EU AI regulation has had amendments already. I can't tell you the amount of amendments that the GDPR has had since its inception in 2016, right? Laws and regulations are made for amendments. No law is perfect. no regulation is perfect. That's a fact. As environments evolve, as people evolve, as businesses evolve, there's a need to actually understand more, basically do more and govern more. And that's very important. So those governing principles have to come based on a foundation. I think the foundational components could be lead. And they could, I gave the example of GDPR and EU AI. EU AI is modeled after the GDPR with some foundational components that are exactly the same. Fairness, accountability. We can start there as a nation, as a region. And in fact, I'm always an advocate of a regional type legislation. I think that's very important if we want to have mobility across the region. But they can be put in place and expect amendments to take place and expect some customization at the different jurisdictions as well. There's nothing wrong with that because we operate differently. But we have to see through the same lens for certain aspects of it.
So
Yeah,
I would add,
think
sorry.
is requiring. Yeah. Go ahead, Mikey.
So I would add there, right? Just as Anil was saying, the obvious answer is, when do we regulate, right? We regulate before the harm, not after, right? And in construction, in my lens, if we wait for AI systems that's already embedded in our courts, hospitals, banks, and systems and public safety, we are no longer regulating, we're reacting, and that's the key. And reaction is always more expensive than preparation. When you regulate, you're paying for it in ounces. When you're reacting, you're paying for it in tons. That's the value there, So the right moment to regulate is when adoption begins, not when the crisis is on our hand. And just like for us in construction, we don't install the guardrails after somebody falls off. The guardrails here, regulation is not the ambulance, So we regulate the moment it starts influencing decisions, not after damage is done. That's simply from my context.
Yeah.
Oh, you think from a government perspective, it's always been regulations after the fact, something else happened and something put in place. I think, and I really like what Anil is saying, I guess we have to have a conversation separately, the issue that I would have mentioned, is we must provide from a top-down approach, and in this case, a regional approach, some form of a toolkit that and one will ask, well, why do you have to do this if you know the requirements? The fact is that that's why we have governance. That's why we have regulatory and laws and so forth. Sometimes not everybody get it. So, and then there are persons that are asking for information. They're looking for information. Sometimes they might say, well, I want information in our own context and even looking elsewhere. So we have to be able to provide some form of toolkit when it comes to surrounding AI from a CARICOM or regional perspective down into the host countries. And here's another problem, and that's one of the reasons why we are very focused on bringing all this here together, because if you look at the CTU, the UNESCO, CARICOM, all these have their own bits and pieces of different frameworks and everything, and everybody have to choose one. And that is the problem that we see within the region. Everyone comes with a silo type of, it's still based on existing, maybe EU, AI Act, and so forth, but they come with their own perspective and say, look, here, take this here. And even as much as you try to adjust and say they work with other entities, it is not fashion for us. It's something that still need a model to work with. So I think that based on what Mikey and Neil have been saying, is that we need to understand the context and start working on building those toolkits that are more in line with us. And they cannot remain static. Anybody that could think that digital transformation policies will remain static will have to be, I don't know, maybe sitting on the moon itself, because by 2030, some people expect we're going to have super intelligence, or artificial full general intelligence. And then thereafter, maybe 2040 plus, we're looking at super intelligence or even further. But if you look at what Elon Musk is doing and so many others, building these massive data centers that are kind of like going obsolete in terms of its hardware and so forth, and NVIDIA coming out every few months of more power and more power and more power, it makes you wonder what we're going to see by 2030. And to be honest with you, and we already know, some of you may or may not, that from a military perspective, what we have in civilian sometimes is many years behind. So if you have that jump and leap in technology, it means that eventually you're going to see that leap. And many of us here, living here, would have remembered the cassette player. I don't know about the big reel on this big device. I remember the cassette player. And we had that there for a number of years. Tutu's DVDs came in. Not DVDs, sorry, CDs came in. DVDs. All of us remember the video cassette players. And Tutu's DVDs came, and now we are streaming. And no one ever thought, I don't ever think Chubby's and all those companies would ever thought that they would be not functioning by maybe 2018, 2020. They never thought about it. So therefore, our policies have to be so proactive, and we need that capacity, that human capacity to be able to achieve it, because we can't build positive policies, one, with external factors that are helping us that try to add capacity, and then we don't build it again to sustain it.
I got a question there, Lewis, because I get pushback all the time, right? When we question this, when does regulations stampede or trespass on freedom?
That's a tough one, man. I know you guys all talked a bit about the security surveillance boundary, and you see this in a lot of contexts where there's always a justification for security, whether it's real or not, and it's really hard to disprove that context. And we've also seen where even things like the US Patriot Act, enacted after 9/11 with the best of intentions, perhaps, or perhaps not. And even though it was supposed to sunset, right, not only has it been extended, it's, been expanded over the years to pretty much authorize anything they want. And even among the Five Eyes, the big, global powers, even if they're not technically allowed to spy on their own citizens, they're happy to spy on each other's citizens and then pass that data through the back door. So, at some level, it's kind of already out of the bag, and it's really a matter of keeping control of that last mile, where how is that AI or that technology applied in that space between the actual computer and the system and the human, and I think that's really where the regulations have some hope of playing a role, is just putting constraints there. And we see it with some of the different data protection acts around the US and around the world that try to control the use of facial recognition or other technologies by police. But then at the same time, it's, if the police aren't willing to police themselves, then how do you really enforce any of it? So it all really comes back to a human problem. And I think that's, Edward and Anil and Mikey, you guys all touched on this, that it's awareness and getting people to a place where they actually appreciate that this is important for all of us, rather than just a few that want to have control or power. So how do you balance that out? And fortunately, we're all here for in the CCGI.
Yeah, hopefully Edward and Anil can help me answer, right? Because this is what I tell my guys when that question comes to me in a construction frame is, in construction, building codes do not take away freedom to build. They protect your right to live in a structure that won't collapse, right? It won't fall down on you. Regulations should do the same thing for AI. It prevents the collapse of trust, fairness, and rights. And that's how simple I put to my guys, in my context, in my lens. And Edward, and I'm sure Anil can extrapolate on that,
What you say is extremely true. But when it comes always to regulations, at some point, it's always saying to this seesaw effect where there's a much more bigger heavy stone on the other side, and it goes. And the reason for that, there's many things come out sometimes, unfortunately, as a vital or critical need, and it doesn't have all of the partners. I'm certain that when codes came up, you had at the time, a lot of persons coming together, engineers and so forth at some point, and then you move stuff from there. But when you, let's say, building something for a different environment, and you only have one-sided from some other part of the world, they don't understand the requirements, and then you end up building and you realize the building started to sink, it started to crack, or whatever it is, because now that regulation wasn't any contest. So I think that when there's a lack of good partnership and collaboration, when the regulations leave the paddocks. The only option for us as persons is to now formalize groups, be part of groups, and work with groups that have a more voice to be able to bring some level of balance. Because take for instance with the what do we call it now? With the facial recognition, at one point here within the Caribbean, it wasn't even recognizing our African features and etc. Even the voices, the voiceovers and so forth. And it's over a period of time it gets better because there's a particular need. It may be some form of financial need to sell back the solutions back into the environment. Again, our only recourse, Mikey, is to find those groups and make sure that their voice is heard. In America, we like to say find your senator and so forth. We have to really communicate, and hopefully our politicians will listen to us so that when these regulations are going into place, that we have a voice that we can able, because we're not like in France and so forth, that we're gonna raise up and be burning and so forth. I actually heard a friend of mine from I think Tanzania or something like that. And he's saying that right now there's a lot of upheaval down there. So we in the Caribbean, we're still very much civilized, but our only thing is to try to get that voice and use like institutes and other organizations and so forth to be able to work with to attain those common goals.
Yeah. Thanks, Edward. Louis, if you don't mind, I just wanted to jump in for the last few minutes because it's almost time for us to wrap up the panel. So I wanted to ask the panelists their thoughts on when it is we have bias that's deliberately put in the context of the geopolitics. So you have countries with their particular objectives looking to ensure that they dominate and be able to manage the algorithm in such a way. And I really appreciated, Anil, your explanation with the recipe, the ingredients and what really the algorithm is. Because by the time you use the model, and this, I love that this panel said it. You use it a few times, you get the answer that you want, you like it, and now you become immune to the risks that you now face. So just your final thoughts. We have a lot of directors present here. They're in the Caribbean needing to deal with these issues where there are global politics at play. What would be your advice? Because we don't have the regulations, so we're still developing the frameworks. What are those considerations they should have for their policies in dealing with AI when you are looking at what is happening in the geopolitical environment? And I'm sorry, you already only have a few minutes to each give your take on that.
I will go say everything very quickly. I think you have to build your own models. You have to understand that at the end of the day, the customer, who you're working with, is going to be holding you accountable for the output. They don't care if it's going to be AI or whatever is going to be used. You have to understand, for you to guarantee as best as possible, build the capacity and start learning these models, identify which models is best for your organization through risk assessments, et cetera, through your AI management system program. Because if that's ISO 2001 or whatever it is, the fact is that you have to take that particular approach and build that awareness, because you're going to be liable at the end of the day. If you sell these products in other markets, you have to also make sure that you're still not only in compliance, but you're not liable. So therefore, that awareness is going to be critical for you to understand and have that team that could give you that knowledge, who have the experience, who have the competence. So let's use the word competence. You could research it, see what is in circle to go forward from there. Thank you.
I can speak just very briefly, Kamala, and I hope I'm zoning into your question. It was fairly broad. But I think what's important with any model is explainability. So while AI does the work and the hard work at that, it does all of the complex simulations and pattern recognition and so on. It generates an output. There must be explainability for the output. If you can't do it, you shouldn't use it, right? Because it's obscure to you. Now, having said that, AI by its sheer nature is not all, it's almost inexplicable up to a particular point. That's understood. but you should be able to do some level of engineering that can tell you this makes sense, and it makes good sense of that, and the regulations have to speak to it, right? That's one of the founding or foundational aspects of the legislation itself, and it should apply in policy, right, with any local or entity policy. I think that's very important. And the last part of that is always make sure and get all the key stakeholder inputs. I spoke about the 3 lines of defense, but there are other stakeholder groups. Persons need to know, understand, not just to adopt, right, but to embrace. And that's very important. The more we can explain, it indicates, it's an indicator of our understanding of it. And then we believe and we tend to adopt.
Yeah, that's great there, Anil and Edward. And I will just, simply put again from my lens here, and what I tell my teams and how we do policy is, policy must answer who owns the data, who's accountable, what values the system optimizes for, how decisions are audited, and who the true system truly serves, which is the voice of the customer for us, because we're building for our customer. That's what the policy must enshrine and must answer before we put it out there and make it concrete.
Thank you guys so much. Louis, it's now 12:29, so we're going to bring the panel to a close. Thank you so much. Any last word from you?
No, thank you all. It's been exceptional, and thank you. Looking forward to the rest of the panels today and joining you all.